Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That is for you to decide. Hollow's End is upon us, friends, and in the spirit of that, I decided that this video's topic should be one of the scariest things in World of Warcraft. PvP. It seems you either love it or you hate it, and there isn't a very large crowd that falls in between. My stance has generally been to avoid it, unless incentivized with lucrative rewards such as mounts. So in that regard, you could consider me extremely casual when it comes to PvP. So bearing that very important detail in mind, let me just say that I think Solo Shuffle is the best thing to have happened to WoW PvP in over a decade. But before we get to Solo Shuffle itself, allow me to paint you a picture of my history with WoW Arena. Starting at the end of Mists of Pandaria, Blizzard started awarding vicious mounts during each PvP season. The first pair could be obtained by winning rated battlegrounds, but thereafter it was pretty much relegated to winning 3v3 arena matches. This would be the case at least until BFA, when they started to expand it to 2v2 and other forms of rated PvP. But during Mists of Pandaria, Warlords of Draenor, and Legion, the vicious mounts always came from winning rated 3s. Now this was fine enough, there wasn't even a minimum rating, so you could be absolutely terrible at PvP and still get it eventually. I really didn't mind this outside of one factor, and that one factor was my own team. I'm not friends with anyone who PvPs regularly, and I could never reliably get my other friends to participate through the whole grind, which meant I always had to use the group finder to make pre-mates, and trying to keep two random people happy in a group with you in PvP is not an easy task. It is not rare at all for someone to drop group after just 2 consecutive losses, as if you shouldn't always expect a 50-50 win rate anyways. And sometimes, despite me labeling the groups as super chill and that I'll take anybody, I would still get whispers from one of the randos asking me to kick the other rando because they didn't think they were good enough. It was a headache, and although the grind itself wasn't that bad, I always kind of dreaded doing it. The only seasons in this time period where I really enjoyed it were in Mists of Pandaria, because for this whole stretch I was using my Beast Mastery Hunter for the grind, and back in MoP every spec was broken in different ways, and BM Hunters were broken in that they could do almost all their damage without needing line of sight on the enemy players. Seriously, you didn't need to maintain a damage buff with barbed shot, and kill command only required your pet to have line of sight, not you yourself. So I would just spend a good chunk of each match hugging pillars so that I was taking no damage, and any damage I did take would heal up pretty quickly thanks to Spirit Bond being pretty bonkers back then. It was stupid and fun and absolutely needed to be changed, but it was still kind of sad when it was. They started to shake up how the grind worked in BFA. At this point you could start making progress in 2s, but only wins above 1400 rating would contribute. Now for the most part this was exciting news for me because, as previously stated, the worst part of the grind was just keeping 2 other players around and happy. Logistically speaking, only having to do that with one player is more than twice as easy. There was a trade-off for this convenience though, which is that a win in 2s only contributed 0.4% instead of the 1% that a 3s win would. This meant that once you were above 1400, and assuming you maintain that rating, you would need 250 wins to complete your grind. So you were looking at a minimum of like 511 games, and in practice, a fair bit more than that. And although I can generally maintain 1400, it wasn't outside the realm of possibility for me to dip, which just added another element of stress to the whole ordeal. Again, I think the situation was an improvement, but not a drastic one. And for all 4 of BFA's seasons, I continued to use my Hunter, just because I find playing caster DPS in Arena to be extremely frustrating. And honestly, I've never really tried melee PvP. I like to joke that a bunch of the melee specs are just unga bunga, but I just have the suspicion that in reality I would be terrible at it. Additionally, in previous seasons you were awarded a Vicious Saddle, which you could then spend on any of the Vicious mounts. From here on out, your first time completing the grind in a season would just award you the current Vicious mount, and thereafter you would obtain Vicious Saddles that you could spend on prior mounts. Anyways, not a lot changed in Shadowlands, except for the very nice lowering of the rating requirement from 1400 down to 1000. For any good PvPer, this change was completely inconsequential, but for me, it just completely removed the possibility of dipping below and took that stress out. On my end, I finally shook things up a little bit in that I used my main, my Frost Mage, for the grind, which I did solely because I was too cheap and or lazy to get good legendaries on my alts. I pretty much just got them all rank 1s, which I would have been fine PvPing with them, but I know other people would have hated it and given me flack for it. which fair enough. Now, it was during Shadowlands that Solo Shuffle was actually introduced to the game. However, back then it was just a brawl. Although I think they established pretty early on that if it was popular enough, it would find a more permanent place in the game. But this worked out pretty well. It allowed them to collect a lot of data and pretty much playtest the whole thing en masse. I never played it back then, so I can't really comment on it, but with Dragonflight, it was made an official game mode. It was, and probably still is, a pretty controversial addition to the game. Personally, I really wanted to like it, even though it kind of intimidated me at first, and I'm happy to say it pretty much exceeded my expectations in every way. I did need to do random battlegrounds for 1 or 2 evenings to get enough PvP gear to even be able to queue, which I completely understand, even if I personally would have no qualms about people queuing up in PvE gear. It's no skin off my back. But either way, in the grand scheme of things, it's a pretty minimal barrier to entry. And the experience was great. So much so that I wound up grinding out 4 vicious mounts in 1 season, which was kind of tiring and only really happened because I had missed seasons 1 and 2. But the fact that I had the stamina to do that in the first place is a testament to just how stress-free the game mode is. It was also probably the biggest personal shakeup. I started doing them on my Holy Priest. This was done primarily to save on queue times. I wind up waiting about 30 seconds per match instead of 30 minutes, but I think it worked out pretty well because I wound up enjoying healing quite a bit. Like a lot of people, I can wind up getting pretty panicky in a PvP environment, which can really screw you over as a DPS player, and certainly can as a healer too, but I feel like the role just lends itself much better to the mindset of panic, because you sort of channel that panic into doing whatever it takes to keep yourself and your teammates alive. It's kind of weird, and I may actually be quite wrong about that, but it just feels like there's sort of a harmony there. And yeah, in the War Within, I am continuing to do the grind on my Holy Priest. Although this time I am going about it in a far more gradual manner. I'm just trying to get near the conquest cap each week, which usually winds up being about 3 matches. So I only wind up investing in about 1 hour a week. The grind will probably take most of the season this way, but it is a much more chill and just happier process for me now. But that was a whole lot about me, and I haven't actually explained how Solo Shuffle works yet. So for those not yet aware, Solo Shuffle is just Threes Arena, but you queue up as a single player. You don't need a group ahead of time. Each match will pull in 6 players and have them participate in 6 separate rounds. In any given match, there are 2 healers and 4 DPS/tanks, although it is extremely rare to actually run into a tank. More power to them though. The game will also actively avoid putting more than one of each spec into a match, which I think is a bit of a shame because some of those matchups could be really zany, but I can also understand why they did it. The 6 rounds jumble players up each time, resulting in every possible combination you can get that still keeps the healers on separate teams. You get the usual 1 minute of prep time before the first match, and then each successive one is 30 seconds. Each round starts out with 10% dampening, which starts to ramp up significantly faster than normal arena matches do. And each round ends when just 1 player is eliminated. Though as a Holy Priest, I should clarify, you aren't considered dead until Spirit of Redemption expires, and my teams do occasionally manage to snag a victory from the jaws of defeat this way. Anyway, once 1 player is eliminated, the next round begins, and this continues until all 6 have been completed. At the end of each match, your rating is appropriately adjusted based on how many wins you got, and you are awarded conquest and honor based on how many wins you got. As for progress on the vicious mounts, you will earn 2% progress as long as you won at least 3 of the rounds. So technically you make progress even if you just draw. At any rate, because of all the gameplay changes, each round is actually pretty quick, and like I said before, the whole match usually takes less than 20 minutes. Unfortunately, you can miss out on a lot of the rewards if any player happens to drop before the whole match is complete, but this has happened very rarely for me, maybe like 5 matches total. But all in all, the game mode feels pretty much perfect, or at least as perfect as you could make Arena for a casual player like myself. There are really only 2 changes I would make to it. The most important one is that I would change mount progress to be based on each round and not the match as a whole. The fact that I can win 2 out of the 6 rounds and get 0 progress out of that kinda sucks. Similarly, if I happen to win the first 3 rounds, then I don't actually gain anything by winning the latter 3. I'm still gonna try, to be fair to my teammates, but unless that particular match can push me to the next PvP rank, there's really no incentive for me. So instead of 2% progress for going at least 3-3, I'd rather it be something like 0.67% progress for each individual round you win. It's not huge, but I honestly just don't understand why it is the way it is currently. And the other change I would make is just to include every arena map in the pool. You can currently wind up being placed in the Mugambala, the Ring of Trials, Tiger's Peak, Blade's Edge Arena, Enigma Crucible, Maldraxxus Coliseum, Tolviron Arena, Ruins of Lordaeron, Nokudan Proving Grounds, and Blackrook Hold Arena. That is 10 of the current 15, but for some reason the other 5 are not included. These are the Robodrome, Empyrean Domain, Hook Point, Dalaran Sewers, and Ashamane's Fall. I see no consistent reason for why these 5 are excluded, especially Ashamane's Fall. That thing has nothing going on. It's just an empty room with 3 pillars. Again, it's not super important, but Arena has so few maps to begin with, why would you want less diversity? But now that we've gone over how Solo Shuffle works, let me detail to you all the reasons I think it's amazing. First and foremost is just the accessibility. It is infinitely easier to solo queue into something than to form a 3-man pre-made that you have to maintain and then queue into. The only barrier to entry is that PvP item level, which doesn't even take that long to get. And I think the improved accessibility alone has probably caused a much larger portion of the player base to actually participate in Arena. That is completely speculation on my part. It could be horribly inaccurate. It just makes sense, you know? Next is just the sheer amount of efficiency that Solo Shuffle brings to the table. Because you're essentially playing 6 arena matches just with all the players already loaded in and everything. They're able to run you through those quote-unquote matches much more quickly. This is due to just there being less loading time and the prep time being cut in half for all except the first round. Now, arguably, it might have been more efficient if you consistently had a pre-made group to do Arena with, but I don't think I ever, in the 5 expansions before Dragonflight, managed to knock out 6 matches in the span of 20 minutes. Plus the fact that you can just jump in whenever you have time. No coordination necessary. Of course, my view here is also colored by the fact that I'm a healer. I have very fast queue times, so I'm not sitting there for a half hour beforehand, but that factor was definitely not non-existent for regular Arena. And if the queue times do bother you, there's nothing stopping you from doing it on one of your healers. My personal favorite aspect of Solo Shuffle is just the reduced toxicity. I've always considered the worst part of Arena to just be your own teammates, but people in Solo Shuffle, by and large, are just super chill about the whole experience. Yeah, there's always going to be some people complaining that they died and it's obviously the healer's fault or whatever. But most people recognize that you're in this with players for a little bit and then you're not going to see them again, except by chance. And even if you think that one of the players does suck, well, good news, for half of the rounds, they're going to be on the enemy team. There's literally no downside to them being in your lobby. Ultimately, PvP is always going to get people a little fired up, but Solo Shuffle has done a phenomenal job of mitigating that and keeping people pretty mellow. Another benefit, in my opinion, is that your personal rating winds up being a lot more accurate. Back when I did regular Arena, I feel like my rating could swing wildly just based on my group members. There were probably occasions where I was carrying others, and there were definitely occasions where I was being carried by others. That's just not a thing in Solo Shuffle. Also, because any given match rearranges players into every possible combination, the game can actually measure your skill with you as the only constant and everything else being a wash. Essentially, how many of the 6 rounds you win is entirely dependent on you. Of course, this isn't 100% true. There's a bajillion factors that could change things, but you know, by and large, it's all on you. Another benefit is that you're just gonna get more diversity in your comps, because the game's essentially just grabbing 6 random specs, throwing them in, and jumbling them up. Of course, some specs are always going to be more popular, and there's always going to be a few specs that are overperforming that season, but the team composition as a whole is something you can't control here. So you can have some pretty weird matchups. Pretty much the only thing that's out the window is double specs, because those just aren't allowed. But stuff like constantly running into Rogue Mage Druid, or whatever the popular comp is, that's just not a thing here. If it happens, it's almost entirely by chance. A pretty unimportant advantage, but one that I enjoy, is just the existence of these Solo Shuffle leaderboards. These are of course divided by region, but also by the 39 individual specs. And each spec shows the top 1,000 players, so I actually show up on these pretty consistently, which is wild to me. I don't belong anywhere near a PvP leaderboard, and yet, here I am. For the record, I am a player who very consistently hits 1400 rating, will generally breach 1600 rating, and really never hit 1800 of my own merit, which on the Holy Priest leaderboards usually lands me between rank 450 and like 800. But by doing some arena early in the season before a lot of the players had arrived on the scene, I managed to actually hit rank 249, which is bonkers. Again, this doesn't really matter, it's just kind of fun, you know? And the last major advantage, which is probably a more debatable one, is that it measures a different skill set than regular arena. In normal arena, your knowledge of the metagame and your ability to communicate with your teammates plays a massive factor in your success. Solo Shuffle tends to not care about that so much, but care a lot about adaptability. You need to be able to adapt to your own team composition, to the enemy's team composition, and playing with people that you don't know who are constantly getting shuffled out. It's almost a wild, wild west situation, and one could even argue that it's a purer test of your skill. I'm not going to argue that because I'm a noob and don't know what I'm talking about, and actual PvPers would probably devour me for having such an opinion. But yeah, those are pretty much all my thoughts on Solo Shuffle. It's just been such a huge quality of life improvement, and thank you so much for bringing it to us, Blizzard. Now just add some more diverse arena maps. Maybe one with 0 pillars, maybe one with 50 pillars. Why are they all so samey? I do know why, I just don't care. I also want to include just a little footnote about Battleground Blitz. The spirit of the game mode is essentially the same as Solo Shuffle, but for Battlegrounds. There are a lot of modifications from regular Battlegrounds, including smaller lobbies. And because they're not going to shuffle around 16 players and do 5 bajillion rounds, it's never going to accomplish all of the same goals, but I think it's great news that it has become a thing. Honestly, it kind of blows my mind that it took us 20 years to get Battlegrounds with a rating system that you didn't need a full pre-made to do. I bet they're a lot more fun when everyone in your lobby is of approximately the same skill level. Like, this is a very ubiquitous concept in competitive games, so it just now becoming a thing means it was probably just really low on Blizzard's priority list. But hey, better late than never, right? I don't know if I'll actually ever wind up doing any, but it's nice that it's there. Quite serendipitously, this week's drawing wound up being Genn Greymane. I chose him because there aren't really any important characters that I associate with Arena, but at least in the lore, he's one of the most PvP characters. He hates the undead, or at least he used to, before the storm kind of softened him on that a bit. But yeah, it just sort of happened on accident that we wound up getting a werewolf for the episode before Halloween. And what to say about Genn Greymane as a character? You know, I like to dunk on him a lot. He's a racist old man, and he hates Sylvanas because his son has awful survival instincts and took the arrow for him. But I legitimately think he's a great character and actually enjoy him. He's a bit of an instigator and fun to have around. So I'm really sad that they decided to basically retire him at the end of Dragonflight, with the in-game reasoning that he's just too stuck in his ways. And they replaced him with his daughter, who's had virtually no screen time, who a large portion of the player base probably didn't even know the name of. It's Tess, by the way, and who actually concluded in the Worgen Heritage questline not to become a Worgen. Now, in-universe, it kind of makes sense. Being a Worgen and being a Gilnean are not the same thing. But let's be real here. If you're a Worgen player, she's your queen now. Why is the leader of the Worgen playable race not a Worgen? They just put her in there because they're allergic to faction conflict nowadays. And I'm not trying to dunk on Tess specifically. She's a fine enough character, what little we have seen of her, but just like, come on. I feel bad for Worgen players at this point. They're really having a rough time of it. And very naturally, I just stuck them in Gilneas City. You know, that capital city that was never actually made a capital, that we finally retook after 13 years in a 12-minute quest chain. So now there's like a mailbox and innkeeper there. I'm so sorry, you guys. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next week. Bye-bye.